The date is November 14, 1965. The location is the Central Highlands of Vietnam, a place known as the Chu Pong Massif. To the North Vietnamese army, this terrain is not a battlefield, it is a fortress. It is a sanctuary. For years, the dense triple canopy jungle, the suffocating heat, and the sheer inaccessibility of the landscape have served as the ultimate defense against foreign aggression. The French had died here. The South Vietnamese army refused to enter here. It is a place where the logic of conventional warfare dissolves into the humidity. Deep within the command bunkers carved into the red clay of the mountain, Lieutenant Colonel Nguyen Huy An of the People's Army of Vietnam studies his maps. He is a hardened veteran, a man who defeated the French at Dien Bien Phu. He knows war. He knows logistics. And he knows that to move a battalion of soldiers into this valley would take weeks of marching. It would require supply lines of porters carrying rice and ammunition on their backs, moving silently down the Ho Chi Minh Trail. It is a mathematical certainty of war. Mass requires time. But at 10:48 in the morning, the mathematics of war are shattered. It begins not with a sighting, but with a sound. At first it is a distant, rhythmic thrumming, like the beating of 1,000 insect wings. It grows louder, vibrating through the heavy, wet air of the valley floor. It is a mechanical roar that drowns out the call of the gibbons and the rustle of the wind. Lieutenant Colonel An and his staff freeze. The sound is coming from everywhere and nowhere. It is coming from the sky. Suddenly, the jungle canopy at the base of the mountain, a small clearing the Americans would later designate Landing Zone X-ray, erupts in chaos. The tall elephant grass is flattened by a violent downwash. Dust kicks up into a blinding red fog. And out of this mechanical storm, they appear. Not marching, not tired from a week-long trek. They simply step out of the air. American soldiers. Hundreds of them. Fresh, equipped, and seemingly teleported into the very heart of the enemy's sanctuary. To the North Vietnamese observers peering through binoculars from the slopes of Chu Pong, this is an impossibility. It defies every rule of engagement they have studied. There are no trucks. There are no roads. There is no visible supply line stretching back to the coast. There is only the sky and the relentless, deafening whop 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 of the machines that brought them. This is the moment the Soviet advisors back in Hanoi, reading the urgent teletypes later that day, would struggle to comprehend. The Americans had just inserted an entire battalion of the 1st Cavalry Division directly into the kill zone of 3 veteran North Vietnamese regiments. By all conventional logic, the Americans have just committed suicide. They are surrounded. They are outnumbered 7-1. They have no tanks, no fixed artillery positions nearby, and no way to retreat. But the Americans are not acting like men who are trapped. They are digging in. If you are fascinated by the hidden history of military strategy and the Cold War's most intense flashpoints, make sure to subscribe to Cold War Impact. We uncover the stories the history books often leave out. The confusion among the North Vietnamese ranks is absolute. The enemy has bypassed the jungle entirely. Lieutenant Colonel An orders his troops to attack. He believes he has caught the Americans in a blunder of arrogance. He orders the 33rd, 66th, and 320th Regiments to converge on the landing zone. His strategy is simple: overrun them before they can dig in. Crush them with sheer weight of numbers. In 1954, at Dien Bien Phu, the Viet Minh had strangled the French by cutting off their air supply and encircling them, and believes he is seeing history repeat itself. But as the North Vietnamese regulars surge forward, moving through the tall grass like ghosts, they encounter something terrifying. The Americans are not fighting alone. As the first wave of North Vietnamese soldiers assaults the perimeter, the sky rips open. It is not just the rifles of the infantrymen they are facing. The air above the battlefield seems to be alive. The helicopters that dropped the soldiers did not leave. They converted into gunships. They hover just above the tree line, raining down rockets and machine gun fire with a precision that seems supernatural. Back in the command bunker, the reports coming in are frantic. "The enemy is everywhere," a radio operator screams. "The fire is coming from the trees, from the ground, from the clouds." The North Vietnamese commanders try to adjust. They try to find the flanks. But there are no flanks. The enemy is a circle, a bubble of violence expanding in the middle of their territory. And every time the North Vietnamese mass their forces for a decisive blow, the volume of fire intensifies. It is a wall of steel. But the true mystery, the thing that begins to gnaw at the minds of the Soviet observers, analyzing the battle data, is the sustainability. In a normal siege, the surrounded force runs out of ammunition. They run out of water. They run out of blood. The battle at Ia Drang rages for hours. The heat is oppressive, over 100 degrees Fahrenheit. The Americans are firing thousands of rounds a minute. They should be empty. They should be clicking dry. Instead, the North Vietnamese scouts report a baffling sight. In the middle of the firefight, with mortar rounds exploding and machine gun fire shredding the vegetation, the helicopters return. They do not care about the danger. They dive into the hot landing zone, kicks boxes of ammunition out the doors, load up the wounded, and lift off again within seconds. It is a conveyor belt. The Americans have built an invisible bridge through the sky. To the Soviet military theorists who rely on heavy rail lines and massive armored columns, this concept is alien. It is air cavalry. It is the idea that a soldier is no longer tethered to the ground. The Soviets watch the reports with a growing sense of dread. If the Americans can do this here, in the most remote, hostile terrain in Vietnam, where can they not go? If they can resupply a surrounded battalion indefinitely from the air, does the concept of encirclement even exist anymore for them? By nightfall on the first day, the situation for the North Vietnamese has shifted from an aggressive ambush to a desperate struggle to understand the beast they are fighting. The Americans are still there. The perimeter is holding, and the sky above the Chu Pong Massif is filled with lights and noise. But the North Vietnamese believe they still have the advantage. Night is their ally. The American air machines cannot fly effectively in the pitch black of the jungle night. The coordination will break down. The air bridge will close. Lieutenant Colonel An prepares his forces for a massive night attack. He will use the darkness to creep close, to get inside the American perimeter, to engage in hand-to-hand combat where the American technology cannot save them. He calls it grabbing the enemy by the belt buckle. If they are close enough, the American artillery and air power will be useless for fear of hitting their own men. It is a sound tactical plan. It relies on the limitations of technology. It relies on the belief that the Americans are blind in the dark. As the sun sets over the ridge, plunging the valley into an abyssal blackness, the North Vietnamese troops fix bayonets. They crawl forward, inch by inch. They can hear the Americans digging foxholes. They can hear the whispers. They are close. They are ready to overrun the invaders and prove that machines cannot defeat the spirit of the jungle. They do not know that the Americans have brought something else with them, something that the Soviet advisors have never seen, something that will turn the night into day and the jungle into an incinerator. The North Vietnamese are about to trigger a code that has never been used in combat before, a code that signifies a unit is in danger of being overrun, a code that authorizes the unleash of every available asset in the theater of war. Broken arrow. The Soviets believe they are watching a tactical blunder by the United States. They believe the 1st Battalion of the 7th Cavalry is a sacrificial lamb trapped in a valley of death. They are investigating a military disaster in the making. They are waiting for the Americans to surrender or die. They are wrong. They are not watching a disaster. They are watching the birth of a new era of warfare, and they are about to see exactly what happens when the United States Air Force and artillery decide that a specific grid coordinate on a map simply should not exist anymore. The mystery for the Soviets is about to shift from "how did they get here?" to "how is anything still alive?" The radio call goes out at exactly 10:42 hours on the second day of battle, though the groundwork was laid in the terrifying darkness of the previous night. Broken arrow. It is a phrase that carries no meaning in the Vietnamese language, and to the Soviet monitors attempting to decrypt American transmissions, it initially appears to be a damage report or a navigational error. They check their codebooks. They scan for references to nuclear accidents, which is the standard Strategic Air Command definition for the term. But in the Ia Drang Valley, broken arrow does not mean a lost nuke. It means the ultimate, desperate measure. It means universal priority. Every available combat aircraft in South Vietnam, drop what you are doing and come here, now. For the North Vietnamese soldiers creeping through the elephant grass, the investigation into this phenomenon begins not with analysis, but with annihilation. They have successfully breached the American perimeter. They are intermingled with the defenders. By the rigid logic of artillery support, they are safe. Conventional doctrine dictates that you cannot shell an enemy who is hugging your own troops. The margin for error is zero, but the Americans break the rules. The Soviet advisors in Hanoi, later reviewing the after-action reports, are confronted with accounts that read like hallucinations. Survivors described the sky turning into a solid ceiling of noise. It is not just one flight of bombers, it is a vertical assembly line. The Americans establish a stack over the battlefield, a tower of aircraft orbiting at intervals of 1,000 feet, stretching from the treetops up to 30,000 feet. At the bottom are the A-1 Sky Raiders, slow-moving piston engine relics from the Second World War. The Soviets had dismissed these planes as obsolete. They were wrong. These planes can fly low and slow, delivering napalm with surgical precision. Above them are the F-100 Super Sabres, the jets, screaming in at near supersonic speeds to drop high-drag bombs. Above them, F-4 Phantoms. The North Vietnamese commanders watch in horror as the jungle around them evaporates. The Americans are calling in airstrikes within 50 meters of their own positions. The heat from the napalm sucks the oxygen out of the foxholes. The concussion from the bombs ruptures eardrums. But the true anomaly, the thing that baffles the Soviet analysts trying to make sense of the defeat, is the coordination. In the Soviet Red Army, an artillery strike of this magnitude requires hours of planning by a centralized command post. Orders must flow down from the division to the regiment to the battery. Calculations must be double-checked. Approval must be granted. It is a slow, methodical machine. Here, the machine is reacting instantly. The North Vietnamese shift their attack to the south. The fire shifts to the south within seconds. They feint to the east. The sky falls on the east. Who is controlling this? How can a chaotic, surrounded infantry battalion conduct a symphony of destruction involving dozens of aircraft from different branches of the military, all while fighting hand-to-hand? The Soviet investigation into the Ia Drang anomaly quickly identifies a terrifying new reality. The American infantryman is no longer just a rifleman, he is a sensor, he is a targeting beacon. Through the radio on his back, a single 20-year-old private can command the firepower of a battleship. As the smoke clears and the battered North Vietnamese regiments retreat into Cambodia, leaving behind thousands of bodies, the Soviet military intelligence apparatus goes into overdrive. They need to understand what just happened. This was supposed to be a massacre of the Americans. Instead, it was a demonstration of a new kind of war. They begin to build the legend of the air cavalry. Reports flow back to Moscow detailing the impossible mobility of the American forces. The Soviets have helicopters. Of course, the Mi-4 is a capable machine, but they use them as trucks to move supplies from point A to point B behind the lines. The Americans are using them as horses. They are using them to jump over the front lines entirely. One Soviet analysis, drafted in late 1965, struggles to categorize the threat. Is it an Air Force operation? Is it an infantry operation? It fits neither category. It is a hybrid monster. The report notes with alarm that the Americans have solved the terrain problem. For centuries, military strategy was dictated by geography. Mountains blocked tanks, swamps stopped trucks, jungles hid guerrillas. The air cavalry ignores geography. The terrain is irrelevant. The only terrain that matters is a flat patch of ground large enough for a skid to touch. The Soviets begin to develop theories, some of them dangerously wrong, to explain the American success. One theory circulating in the halls of the Kremlin is that the Americans have developed a new, secret computer system for battlefield management. The coordination at Ia Drang was so tight, the stacking of aircraft so complex, that Soviet engineers believe it could not have been managed by human voice over radio. They suspect the Americans are using an automated data link, a technology decades ahead of its time. They waste valuable resources hunting for this non-existent battle computer, not realizing the solution was far simpler and more human. Another theory focuses on the psychological aspect. The sheer volume of ammunition expended millions of dollars worth of ordnance to protect a patch of worthless grass leads some Soviet economists to conclude that this strategy is a bluff. They argue that the United States cannot sustain this rate of consumption. They are fighting a rich man's war, one analyst writes. They will bankrupt themselves in a year. This conclusion, while logically sound from an economic perspective, fails to understand the American industrial capacity. The Soviets assume the supply of bombs is finite. They do not yet grasp that the American supply chain is a fire hose that never turns off. The investigation deepens. The North Vietnamese provide captured equipment to their Soviet patrons. They bring back the black M16 rifles, which the Viet Cong call the Black Rifle of Death. The Soviets examine the lightweight plastic, the high-velocity bullet. It looks like a toy compared to their rugged AK-47 assault rifles. But then they look at the wounds it creates. The bullet tumbles on impact, causing massive hydrostatic shock. It is a vicious weapon. But the rifle is not the mystery. The mystery is the radio. The Soviets dissect the AN divided by PRC-25 radio carried by the American RTOs, radio telephone operators. It is a marvel of transistor technology, rugged, reliable, clear. This box is the true weapon. This is what allowed the broken arrow call to reach the sky. Yet, despite holding the physical pieces of the puzzle, the radios, the rifles, the shell fragments, the Soviet command cannot replicate the software of the battle. They cannot understand the doctrine. In the Soviet system, initiative is punished. A junior officer does not call in an airstrike. He asks permission. If he acts without orders, he is court-martialed. The Americans at Ia Drang acted with a terrifying autonomy. The Soviet analysts read the transcripts of the battle communications. They hear the voices of young American captains and lieutenants telling generals what to do. They hear a chaotic, fluid structure, where the man on the ground is the king, and the generals in the sky are the servants. This inversion of the military hierarchy is the true bogeyman for the Soviets. It challenges the very foundation of their communist command structure. If the American system relies on individual initiative, how do you predict it? How do you counter it? As 1965 turns into 1966, the air cavalry becomes a ghost story in the Warsaw Pact. They fear that if war ever broke out in Europe, in the Fulda Gap, the Americans wouldn't just hold the line with tanks. They would jump over the Soviet tank armies. They would land behind them. They would bring the broken arrow down on the Soviet supply lines. The Soviet response is to double down on what they know: heavy armor, more anti-aircraft missiles, and rigid discipline. They dismiss the helicopter assault as a colonial police tactic, suitable only for fighting guerrillas in the jungle, not for a real war against a peer power. They convince themselves that their heavy surface-to-air missiles would swat the American helicopters out of the sky like flies in a conventional war. They tell themselves that Ia Drang was a fluke, a lucky break where the Americans panicked and threw everything they had at a single problem. They are confident in this assessment. They believe they have analyzed the threat and found it wanting. But they have missed the most critical piece of the puzzle. They are looking at the machines, the helicopters, the jets, the bombs. They are ignoring the invisible infrastructure that made it all work. They are ignoring the sky spy that the Americans haven't even admitted exists yet, the eyes that see deep into the enemy rear, and the specialized, non-combatant aircraft that act as the conductors of this deadly orchestra. While the Soviets focus on the explosions, they miss the silence. They miss the shadow war happening in the electronic spectrum. And they are completely unaware that while they are studying the air cavalry, the Americans are already refining a system that will make the chaos of Ia Drang look like a dress rehearsal. The Soviets think they have solved the mystery. It is just brute force. They are about to learn that it is actually information dominance, and the source of that dominance is hidden in a project so secret, even the soldiers on the ground at Ia Drang didn't know it was helping them. While the Soviet analysts in Moscow were chasing ghosts, searching for non-existent battle computers or secret treaties, the true source of the air cavalry miracle had been born years earlier, not in a war room, but in a dusty, sun-baked testing ground in Fort Benning, Georgia. To understand why the Soviets were so baffled, we must look at the technological deadlock of the late 1950s. Both superpowers faced the same problem: the atomic age. Military strategists knew that in a future war, a single tactical nuclear weapon could wipe out a concentration of troops. The old way of war, massing thousands of men and tanks in one spot, was suicide. An army needed to be dispersed to survive, spread out over hundreds of miles. But if an army is dispersed, it cannot fight effectively. It cannot mass its firepower to attack. It was a paradox: disperse and be weak, or mass and be nuked. The Soviet solution was armor. They built vehicles lined with lead to survive radiation, creating a heavy, lumbering force that required massive rail lines and fuel depots. They bet on weight. The United States bet on speed. In 1962, a radical thinker named General Hamilton Howe was given a blank check by Defense Secretary Robert McNamara. His mission: reinvent the army. Howe looked at the problem and proposed something that sounded like science fiction. He suggested deleting the truck from the table of organization. He suggested replacing the wheel with the rotor blade. This was the birth of the Howe Board, a secret committee that would develop the doctrine of air mobility. But a doctrine is just words on paper without the machine to execute it. And this is where the American technological advantage, the source, truly lay. It wasn't a computer, it was an engine. The Soviets were flying the Mi-4 helicopter. It was a beast, powered by a massive, reciprocating piston engine, the same technology used in World War II bombers. It was heavy. It vibrated violently. And in hot weather, it struggled to lift its own weight. It was a donkey. The Americans had developed the Mustang. In the late 1950s, American engineers at the Lycoming Company had perfected the T-53 turboshaft engine. This was the game changer the Soviets had missed. The T-53 was a jet engine that turned a shaft. It was tiny, about the size of a refined log, yet it produced over 800 horsepower. It weighed half as much as a piston engine, but produced twice the power. When American engineers took this screaming turbine and strapped it to a Bell helicopter frame, they created the UH-1 Iroquois, the Huey. To the Soviet eye, a helicopter was a utility vehicle. It was a crane. To the American pilots at Fort Benning, the turbine-powered UH-1 helicopter was a hot rod. It didn't just fly, it leaped. It could carry a squad of infantry, hover in the thin, hot air of a mountain peak, and dive at 120 knots. But the machine was only half of the secret. The other half was the Red Team experiment at Fort Benning. For 3 years before Vietnam, the US Army conducted massive secret war games in the Carolina woods. They pitted the new air assault units against conventional enemy forces equipped with tanks and heavy artillery, simulating the Soviet Red Army. The results were shocking. In one exercise, the air cavalry unit was able to leapfrog over the enemy's armored spearhead, land in their rear area, destroy their supply depots, and vanish before the enemy tanks could even turn their turrets. They found that a helicopter-borne force could move 15 times faster than a truck-borne force. The Soviets had missed this data. Their intelligence networks were focused on the Strategic Air Command and nuclear missiles. They deemed Army tactical experiments as low priority. They did not realize that the United States was fundamentally rewriting the physics of ground combat. The source of the victory at Ia Drang was not just bravery, it was the specific performance characteristics of the turbine engine. In the Ia Drang Valley, the temperature soared to over 100 degrees. The air density altitude was high. A Soviet piston engine helicopter operating in those conditions would have been grounded. It simply would not have generated the lift. Or, if it did, it would have overheated after 2 sorties. The American T-53 engines ran hot, but they ran. The pilots of the 229th Assault Helicopter Battalion flew non-stop for 16 hours a day. They didn't shut down the engines to refuel. They hot-fueled with the rotors turning, sucking down JP-4 jet fuel and taking off again in seconds. This was the industrial capability the Soviet economists had failed to model. They calculated warfare based on stockpiles. The Americans were fighting based on throughput. The turbine engine allowed a tempo of operations that was physically impossible for a piston engine force to match. Furthermore, the Americans had integrated a weapons system that the Soviets had dismissed as a toy, the aerial rocket artillery. During the testing phase, General Howze realized that the helicopters needed their own escorts. They couldn't wait for the Air Force jets, which were too fast and flew too high to see the details of the jungle. They needed artillery that could fly. They took the UH-1 helicopter and bolted rockets and machine guns to the struts. The Soviets laughed at this concept initially. A helicopter is fragile. One bullet can bring it down. Why turn it into a tank? The American answer was simple. We don't need armor if we don't get hit. The tactics developed at Fort Benning emphasized nap of the earth flying. The gunships didn't fly high. They flew at tree level, popping up only to fire and then vanishing back behind the canopy. They were flying guerrillas. At Ia Drang, this secret preparation paid off. When the broken arrow call went out, it wasn't just random chaos. It was a pre-rehearsed symphony. The forward air controllers, FACs, were flying small Cessna aircraft, the O-1 Bird Dogs, marking targets with white phosphorus smoke. The jet bombers stayed high, the helicopter gunships stayed low, the artillery fired through the gaps. This three-dimensional coordination was the result of thousands of hours of practice in the pine forests of Georgia, practice that the Soviets had completely ignored. The Soviets looked at the map of Vietnam and saw a jungle that made movement impossible. The Americans looked at the map and saw a sky that was wide open. But the most critical part of the source, the piece that would ultimately terrify the Soviet high command when they finally understood it, was the radio discipline. The Americans had decentralized command. In the Soviet army, a request for heavy fire support had to go up the chain of command to a general who would approve it and then send it back down. This loop took anywhere from 20 minutes to an hour. The American air mobile doctrine pushed that authority down to the lowest level. A 22-year-old lieutenant on the ground at Landing Zone X-ray had the authority to talk directly to a colonel flying in a command helicopter 3,000 feet above him. There was no middleman. The decision loop was measured in seconds, not minutes. This speed of information was the true secret weapon. The turbine engine gave them the physical speed. The decentralized radio doctrine gave them the cognitive speed. As Part 3 comes to a close, the stage is set. The Americans have deployed a revolutionary technology and a radical new doctrine that renders the terrain irrelevant. The Soviets are baffled, watching their allies get slaughtered by an enemy that moves like water. But the Soviets are not stupid. They are learning. And as the war drags on, they will make a discovery that changes their confusion into cold, hard fear. They are about to get their hands on the wreckage of a Huey and the pilot who flew it. And what they find inside will force them to rethink their entire strategy for World War III. The mystery is about to unravel, and the shock of the reveal will hit the Kremlin like a thunderbolt. The moment of clarity, the shock, did not happen on the battlefield. It happened months later, in 1966, inside a secure, windowless room at the GRU headquarters in Moscow. Soviet intelligence officers had finally obtained a complete, translated copy of the American after-action report for the Battle of Ia Drang, alongside captured field manuals for the 1st Cavalry Division. For weeks they had been treating the air cavalry as a localized anomaly, a unique tactic for fighting guerrillas in a jungle. They believed it was a colonial strategy, irrelevant to the grand chessboard of a potential World War III in Europe. But as Colonel General Viktor Kulikov pored over the translated documents, the blood drained from his face. He wasn't looking at a tactic, he was looking at the death warrant of the Soviet Red Army. The shock was found in the logistics tables. The Soviets had assumed that the helicopters at Ia Drang were a precious resource, hoarded and protected. But the American numbers told a different story. In just 3 days of fighting, the Americans had flown thousands of sorties. They had burned hundreds of thousands of gallons of aviation fuel. They had transported artillery batteries by air, lifting 2-ton howitzers over mountains and dropping them into firing positions in minutes. Kulikov realized the terrifying truth. The helicopter was not a support vehicle for the Americans. It was the primary vehicle. For 20 years, Soviet doctrine had been built on the deep battle concept. Massive waves of T-54 and T-55 tanks smashing through the enemy lines like a sledgehammer. They assumed the Americans would try to stop them with their own tanks, creating a linear front line. But the documents revealed that the Americans had stopped playing that game entirely. If the United States employed this air mobile doctrine in Europe, the Soviet tank armies would be obsolete before they fired a shot. The Americans wouldn't bother fighting the tanks head-on. They would simply fly over the tank columns. They would land entire divisions of infantry behind the Soviet spearhead. They would sever the fuel lines. A tank without diesel is just a 40-ton paperweight. The mystery of the surrounded battalion at Ia Drang was solved. The Americans were never truly surrounded, because they operated in 3 dimensions while their enemy operated in 2. The realization sent a shockwave through the Soviet military-industrial complex. The Kremlin demanded an immediate answer. How do we stop a vertical army? Their response was a desperate technological sprint. They couldn't redesign their entire army to match the Americans. Their economy couldn't support the turbine engine production. So, they decided to build a fly swatter. They rushed the production of 2 specific weapons designed solely to kill the air cavalry. The first was the ZSU-234 Shilka. It was a terrifying machine, a radar-guided, 4-barreled anti-aircraft cannon mounted on a tank chassis. It could spew 4,000 rounds per minute. It was designed to create a zone of death that no helicopter could survive. The second was the Strela II, known to the West as the SA-7 Grail. It was a shoulder-fired, heat-seeking missile. Cheap, portable, and deadly. It was the Soviet attempt to give every infantryman the power to knock the air cavalry out of the sky. By the late 1960s and early 1970s, the Soviets flooded Vietnam with these weapons. They believed they had solved the problem. They believed the Shilka and the Strela would turn the American tactic into a slaughter. They waited for the reports of American helicopters falling like rain. But the second half of the shock was yet to come. The Soviets failed because they still viewed technology in a vacuum. They thought, We have a missile, therefore we win. They did not account for the American capacity for rapid adaptation. When the Shilka radars turned on, the Americans didn't just die, they adapted. They deployed the wild weasel concept to helicopters. They outfitted ships with radar detectors. When a Shilka lit them up, they would drop to the deck, flying inches above the mud, below the radar horizon. When the heat-seeking SA-7 missiles appeared, the Americans didn't ground their fleet. They improvised. They installed toilet bowl, exhaust deflectors to mix the hot engine exhaust with cool air, confusing the missiles. They developed flare dispensers. But the most devastating countermove, the one that proved the superiority of the air cavalry concept, was the invention of the hunter-killer team, or pink team. The Soviets watched in dismay as the Americans paired a small, nimble observation helicopter, the Loach, with a heavily armed Cobra gunship. The little helicopter would fly low, acting as bait, drawing fire from the hidden enemy. The moment a North Vietnamese soldier opened fire or launched a missile, revealing his position, the Cobra would strike from above with devastating rocket fire. The Soviet countermeasures failed to stop the air cavalry. Instead of grounding the Americans, the increased threat forced the Americans to evolve even faster. The Huey evolved into the Cobra, the world's first dedicated attack helicopter, a machine that looked like a shark and was built for one purpose: hunting. By the early 1970s, the Soviet High Command had to accept a bitter reality. They had built the largest tank army in history, designed to fight a war on the plains of Europe. But the Americans had changed the rules of physics. They had deleted the ground. The baffled command was no longer confused. They were resigned. They realized that in a conventional war, their rear areas were never safe. The front line was everywhere. The air cavalry had successfully turned the entire battlefield into a 360-degree threat environment. The final insult came when the Soviets looked at the attrition rates. They expected the helicopters to be fragile death traps, but the American statistics showed that the Huey was incredibly rugged. Some aircraft returned to base with hundreds of bullet holes, rotor blades shredded, and fluids leaking, yet they still flew. The turbine engine was resilient. The investigation that began with a strange sound over the Chupong Massif in 1965 ended with a fundamental restructuring of Soviet air defense. They spent billions of rubles developing mobile anti-air systems like the Tunguska and the Tor, chasing a threat that was always one step ahead. The Americans had saved a surrounded battalion not by luck, but by proving that encirclement is a myth when you own the sky. The verdict on the air cavalry experiment was delivered not in a boardroom, but in the cold, hard calculus of the body count. When the smoke finally cleared over the Chupong Massif in November 1965, the numbers painted a picture that Soviet strategists found almost impossible to accept. At Landing Zone X-Ray, a single understrength American battalion, surrounded by 3 enemy regiments, had not only survived, they had shattered the enemy. For every American soldier lost in the elephant grass, more than 10 North Vietnamese soldiers lay dead. This was the killer statistic, a 10-to-1 kill ratio in a scenario where the friendly force was encircled. By all historical military precedents, from the Romans at Cannae to the French at Dien Bien Phu, an encircled force is a dead force. The Americans had reversed the laws of gravity. The Soviet High Command was forced to acknowledge a terrifying truth. The United States had successfully industrialized the impossible. They had turned the miracle of saving a lost battalion into a repeatable standard operating procedure. This realization had a profound ripple effect on the Cold War. It drove the Soviet Union into a frantic game of catch-up that they could never quite win. In the late 1960s, realizing they had no answer to the Huey and the Cobra, the Soviet design bureaus rushed to create their own air cavalry machine. The result was the Mi-24 Hind. But even in their imitation, the Soviets revealed their fundamental misunderstanding of the American secret. The Hind was a beast, heavily armored, massive, capable of carrying 8 troops and a staggering amount of weapons. It was a flying tank. The Americans had built a horse, agile, light, and focused on speed and logistics. The Soviets built a tank that could fly. This distinction defined the macro theme of the Cold War's final decades: innovation versus imitation. The American system, driven by competition between private companies like Bell and Hughes, produced agile, specialized machines like the Huey, the Cobra, and later the Black Hawk and Apache. The Soviet system, driven by central planning and a dogma of heavy metal, produced machines that were powerful but clumsy, tied to a rigid doctrine that didn't allow for the flexibility seen at Drang. The air cavalry tactic also exposed the economic disparity that would eventually crumble the Soviet Union. To maintain an air-mobile army requires an immense logistical tail. It requires a manufacturing base capable of producing turbine blades to microscopic tolerances. It requires a fuel supply chain that spans oceans. The United States could afford to burn 400,000 gallons of jet fuel to save a single battalion. The Soviet economy, groaning under the weight of its own inefficiency, simply could not sustain that level of expenditure. They could build the helicopters, but they couldn't afford the doctrine. They couldn't afford to let their pilots fly the thousands of training hours required to master the nap of the Earth flight that saved the Americans at Drang. The legacy of that chaotic week in 1965 is written in the DNA of every modern army. The air cavalry didn't just disappear after Vietnam, it evolved. It became the 1st Cavalry Division and the 101st Airborne Division Air Assault of today. The tactics forged in the fire of the Chupong Massif vertical envelopment, aerial rocket artillery, and the rapid medical evacuation of the wounded became the gold standard. Before 1965, a soldier wounded on the battlefield had a survival rate that hadn't changed much since World War II. If you were hit in the jungle, you died in the jungle. The dust-off pilots, the medical evacuation helicopters, changed that forever. If a soldier could reach a radio, he could be on a surgical table within the golden hour. This did not just save lives, it maintained morale. A soldier fights harder when he knows the sky will come to get him. The Soviets never matched this. In their invasion of Afghanistan decades later, their wounded often waited days for transport. The morale of the Soviet conscript collapsed. The morale of the American volunteer endured. Epilogue. In the end, the mystery that baffled the Soviet command was not technological, it was philosophical. They looked at the Battle of Drang and saw a tactical anomaly. They saw a reckless gamble where the Americans threw expensive machines into a meat grinder. They waited for the Americans to run out of money or nerve or helicopters. They didn't understand that they were witnessing the debut of a new American way of war, a style of combat that replaced the brute force of massed armies with the devastating precision of mobility and firepower. The code, Broken Arrow, was broadcast as a plea for help. But to the history books, it stands as a declaration of dominance. It was the moment the United States proved that there is no such thing as surrounded when you own the sky. The North Vietnamese soldiers who charged into Landing Zone X-ray thought they had trapped their enemy in a box. They didn't realize that the Americans had removed the lid. And as the sun set over the Central Highlands, leaving the battered but victorious troopers of the 7th Cavalry to wait for their ride home, the Soviet observers in Hanoi filed their reports. They used words like unconventional, wasteful, and baffling. They should have used just one word: superior.